name is Eric Wycheck. I am a planning analyst at the Metropolitan Council, and I'm super excited to welcome you all to the Metropolitan Council's Greenhouse Gas Scenario Planning Tool pre-release event. This is our final stakeholder engagement event, and there'll be plenty of opportunities for you to provide feedback as we go through this presentation with you. We have quite a few speakers here, so I'm gonna move along here on the agenda, and hopefully everybody can see my presentation here. Let's go to the next slide. There we go. Some housekeeping items to be aware of. Because this is a Microsoft Teams live event, only presenters will be able to speak and share their video. We do have a Q&A function that runs alongside the event. I would ask you to feel free to post any questions or comments within that function as we go, and we'll be obviously returning to those questions or comments later on in the session. We also have a Mentimeter, a series of Mentimeter exercises to do some polling. That will also be later in the event. We'll be providing details on the Mentimeter as well. And there will be a chance to provide additional feedback towards the end of the meeting. Today's agenda, this is what it looks like. We have the introductions are myself, Eric Wycheck at the Metropolitan Council, Joel Hudding, also at the Metropolitan Council, and then we have a series of guest speakers here, Laura J. from the Regional Director of C40 Cities Climate Leadership Group, and Angie Fife from ICLEI. And then we have a Metropolitan Council video that follows, and then we have some of the academic research findings will be presented during this group, and then we have a web app demonstration by the project lead on this project, Mauricio Leon, and then we have the feedback and conclusion. I'm just going to touch briefly on the Metropolitan Council's role in climate planning generally. A lot of that work, the planning provision of that work is housed within our community development division. We obviously do a lot of climate work that is operational in nature as well. I'll be focusing mostly just briefly here on what we're doing in community development as it pertains to climate planning and resilience planning. Many of you might be aware of our regional development guide, which was adopted in 2014. That is Thrive MSP 2040, which guides the region's development. We established 5 outcomes within that development guide, 2 of which I just want to emphasize here, sustainability and equity. And I really believe that the greenhouse gas scenario planning tool provides a nice intersection of sustainability and equity. Obviously, focusing on mitigating emissions is important, but we also need to think about how we do that in a just and equitable fashion. Our work at the council, we kind of look at it through these 3 lenses. So we lead by example. In other words, we tend to focus on getting our own house in order. And then as we learn through that process, we provide technical assistance to others. So right now, one big project we're doing is an internal climate action plan, looking at the operational function of the council and figuring out really what are the policies and implementation strategies that can really move the needle in terms of mitigation, adaptation, and resilience at the council within our operating function. We also are creating an environmental justice framework, working with partners on that. But whenever we do research projects or internally focused projects, one thing we want to do is translate any of those lessons into tools and resources for local governments and our stakeholder partners. And that's quite often takes a form of technical resources, tools, provision, that sort of thing. But we also work with others on major capital projects and operational projects, working in partnership. And one thing we're trying to do at the council more and more is really embedding these cross-divisional processes for projects and harnessing subject matter experts across our enterprise. So specifically in community development is a little bit more outward facing than some of the other divisions in terms of our planning function. So we do work very closely with the 7-county metro region, which includes the counties and all of the city, township jurisdictions and tribes as well. So the GHG inventory and scenario planning tool is just a part of a suite of tools that we offer through our work at the council. So we also have a climate vulnerability assessment, a surface with purpose project, which looks at greening infrastructure and parking lots and rooftop greening. We also have the Growing Shade project, which is a tree planting prioritization and maintenance project. And then we provide technical assistance through our Planet Technical Assistance Program, the Local Planning Handbook, and SolSmart certification. This is not by any means an exhaustive list, but I just want to provide it here. I'm going to stop presenting, and I'm going to pass this over to Joel Hudding, who is the manager for the research unit at the Metropolitan Council. Thank you.
Yeah, hi everyone. So as Eric mentioned, I'm Joel Hudding, and I lead our research team within community development. Just a little bit about our team. We're pretty big. We'll have about 20 members when we're fully staffed. And so these are researchers and data scientists from lots of different fields. We have sociologists, economists, ecologists, and lots of others supporting our research at the council. And we work in a lot of different areas, which includes population estimates, population and employment forecasts, parks research, land use, development trends, housing, demographics, regional inequities, kind of all the, I think, key topics of regional concern. And of course, collaborate really heavily within the community development division, but also across the council in other areas. And I think that our expertise in these areas, plus the council's transportation and land use planning role generally, I think situates us really well for this type of climate change mitigation research. And so, we've also been really working to build transparency, and this has included a lot of open source technologies that we've implemented, as well as open science principles. And so for this project, it really means we are trying to make this information, whether it's the methodology, whether it's the underlying data, and how it all comes together. We're trying to make that readily and easily available to everyone, and trying to make this tool something that any community can use to look at a range of strategies for their individual context. And I'm really just really excited for our staff and the academic team to present their findings today. I think this really represents the culmination of a lot of years of work to put this together. And along with that, I'm definitely greatly looking forward to your feedback, and ultimately just hoping that this tool, it can really help advance us as a region in being a leader in climate change mitigation. With that, I will pass it along.
Thanks, Joel. That's really great. Next up, we have Laura J., the regional director for North America C40 cities. She's going to be talking about what are science-based targets and what is the city's race to zero. I'm going to read her bio real quick here. So Laura J. is the regional director for North America and is head of the New York office at C40 Cities Climate Leadership Group. Laura's work helps advance climate actions from policies to mitigate emissions to strategies for adapting to climate impacts. So take it away, Laura. Thanks.
Thanks, Eric, so much for inviting me. I hope everybody can hear me. I'm going to share my screen quickly and just show a few slides. Can just confirm that you can see the slides.
Looks great.
Yep. Okay, great. Thanks so much, Eric. So as Eric said, I'm Laura with an organization called C40. And so for those who are not aware of us, we're a membership of the world's largest cities working together to tackle climate change. And so, but one of our really core to our message is really working with cities around the world to support in advancing climate action and really using the resources and materials and kind of platforms that we work at to really elevate the work of cities at all levels. And so really, excited to speak with all of you today who represent such an important region within the United States. We're a global organization. I work only within the United States and Canada, but really what I wanted to provide you today is some of the global context on why it's important for cities of all sizes to really take ambitious action on climate change, what really kind of happened within that context at COP26, that just finished up in Glasgow, and then why science-based targets are important. So I first just wanted to explain kind of what the Cities Race to Zero is. So the Cities Race to Zero is the first time, and this was launched earlier this year, really in the lead up to COP26 with the UN and major city networks such as ICLEI, Global Covenant of Mayors, many others, as an official way, an official platform for cities to make the same level of science-based target commitments that we're asking of national governments. So if you've been tracking kind of any of the work happening for COP26, is all about nations coming with targets around 2030 and 2050. This is the first time that cities had a formal place at the table on this, which is huge because for organizations like ours and really working with cities like all of yours, we really want to make sure that that is recognized because the work is so critical and many times leading. And that's really part of the other story too, is that you all are doing more innovative things many times than national governments. And so that needs a space to put that political pressure. And so the Cities Race to Zero is just that. It's a commitment. It's a pledge to align your work with what the science requires to meet the Paris Agreement goals. And so at Cities Race to Zero, we had over 1,000 cities committed to this target. It was the largest commitment that was brought to COP. And I will say it really made some significant movements. We had mayors speaking in front of the world leaders about the Cities Race to Zero and about the role that cities are playing locally and cumulatively what that means globally, which was the first time that mayors actually really got to speak on those platforms. So really exciting stuff. And, collectively, all of the cities really will reduce 1.4 gigatons annually by 2030. And so, as we're looking at you all being supported to use tools to really map that and create those science-based targets, that is exactly where this feeds into and how it can have a really, truly global impact on the effort that we're trying to make collectively to address climate change. And so as part of the pledge, and you can go to citiesracetozero.org if you want to learn more about it, but cities needed to commit to different high impact actions in different sectors. So this really gets down to what are you going to do to reduce these emissions? And so there's a number of actions from divesting from fossil fuels to addressing sustainable food systems, zero carbon buildings. And this slide just kind of shows what the numbers and obviously cities chose more than one. So this is obviously more than 1,000, but it represents really like a huge momentum in these areas from cities around the world to really address these high impact action areas. And so I think my note to all of you too is there are so many examples to look to help you in really achieving these high impact action sectors, and that you're not the first to do them. And so I think, both learn from each other, but also learn from other cities around the country and around the world and how they've done this. And organizations like C40 and ICLEI can really help you in connecting in those, and same with Global Covenant of Mayors. I just want to touch on some of the media coverage that came out of this at COP that for us was really, really critical. You see Time Magazine, countries bought big promises, cities brought actions. And, I think that that's very much the message. And I think that the motivation that we all kind of, and you all should continue to have on this, is that you can actually make this stuff happen and do it. And we are at a much faster pace. Touching quickly on kind of science-based targets and why they're important. The science-based target piece is the anchoring element of Cities Race to Zero. It is setting a science-based target for 2030 and 2050. And you know, if you tracked any of the stuff at COP, there was a lot of discussion around 2030, which was really the first time that that happened. It wasn't about these mid-century long-term goals. It was really about what's happening in the next decade. And that's what is so essentially critical. And that's what scientists have been telling us is critical. And so that is core to what the Cities Race to Zero is. And so setting a science-based target is first and foremost looking at the science and saying, what does my city need to do in order to do our fair share of the world meeting this collective target that we've committed to of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees. And I think it's important to remember too that that target is not arbitrary. That is one that was also determined by scientists of like, this is really the amount of warming that we should have in order for things to not go really bad. They're still not going to be great, but it's, you know, there's a reason that that's a target. And so the target itself is really something measurable, actionable, and time bound. And so there, as part of, there has been developed a guide, a science-based climate targets guide for cities that has different methodologies, but I know you guys are going to be going over today tools that really help you determine that for your city and what pathways and actions you can actually use to get there. And so I think, you know, my ending really is that data, collecting the data and really setting those science-based targets is critical to understanding what your city needs to do. And then there's resources out there to help figure out kind of how to do it and what the pathways are. But without all of us really taking this baseline of the foundation of using the science as a starting point, then everyone's going to be working at different scales. And, you know, I think one of the best things that came out of COP was an agreement that all the nations need to come back next year and update their nationally determined contributions. So their science-based target, essentially, because it wasn't good enough. It was meant to be 5 years. They said, come back next year. And so I think it's the role of cities to continue to push that and continue to anchor that we are based on what science tells us. And we're going to use data to make our decisions. So I will end there, and feel free to contact me with any follow-up questions. We can put my contact information in the chat.
Thanks so much, Laura. I appreciate that. And I think that really leads us like really well into the next segment, which is how can cities use data to make better climate action planning decisions? Next, we have Angie Fife, who is the Executive Director of ICLEI, Local Governments for Sustainability, which is the first and largest global network of local governments devoted to solving sustainability challenges. Angie's human-centered vision supports local governments to combat global climate change. I'll pass it over to Angie. Thank you.
Hello, everyone, and congratulations to the Met Council for this excellent body of work. We're really excited to have this engagement underway, and we look forward to working with all of the cities and the regions as you move forward with your inventory and mitigation strategies. Laura, excellent job. Thanks so much for all of the partnership around COP and the Race to Zero. We look forward to 2022. How are cities using data to make these decisions? I think as Laura mentioned, the science-based target is indeed the thing that is quite new and important in the work that we're doing this year in 2021 and going forward. Of course, you've all been asked to sign off on commitments in the past. What is different about the Cities Race to Zero is essentially this science-based target and the understanding of what it takes to get to a 2030 emissions level, which will put us all on track to meet our global goals by the mid-century of zero emissions by 2050. At ICLEI, we recently did an analysis using the data of 138 US cities, and we found that in order to meet the US fair share, which is an element of the science-based target, local governments in the US need to reduce emissions by 63% by 2030. And that sounds like a big goal, and it is a big goal. But the other thing that we found is that this goal, while ambitious, is achievable if we are focused on essentially three elements. decarbonization of the grid, removing fossil fuels from the grid and moving the grid to 60 to 80% renewable energy or fossil fuel-free energy by 2030, and accelerating our decarbonization of buildings and transportation. Of course, efficiency plays a huge role as well. Vehicle miles traveled, transit and walking and biking options, land use decisions that you all make at the local level are extremely important. But these are all things that can lead us to this goal and put us on track to achieve these science-based targets. So we wouldn't know that without data, right? We need to have a baseline of emissions, of greenhouse gas emissions occurring at the local level in order for us to then start to apply these strategies and measure our progress. And so this is certainly the importance of the work that the Met Council is doing, and the tool that will be presented today is going to be certainly instrumental in helping all of the cities, towns, and counties in the region to do that. The other thing, of course, that's important, as was teed up very early on, is the equity lens. And we're seeing more data, metrics, et cetera, coming out around equity measurements. And so at ICLEI, we're thinking about ways in which we can better incorporate equity into climate action planning. In the coming year, we'll be updating the U.S. Community Protocol to include equity indicators as well as adaptation and resilience, and looking more at upstream emissions, which I'm sure Dr. Ramaswamy will talk about today. So I will leave it there. Thank you all for your attendance and for your work in this area. We're very excited to be supporting it, and thanks to Met Council for having me here today.
Thanks so much, Angie. Appreciate that. That's great. This moves us to our next section, which is exciting. We are going to fire up a video here that introduces the Council's greenhouse gas scenario planning tool. So here we go. Thanks.
Human activities have warmed the atmosphere, ocean, and land, which has led to extreme heat waves, heavy precipitation, droughts, and other storms. Every inhabited region of the globe is under the threat of climate change. Despite our cold winters, Minnesota's average temperatures have warmed at an alarming rate in the last century, and the risk of flooding has increased substantially. These changes pose a serious threat to our region's natural resources, economy, and our residents.
Cities have a big role to play in reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and because a lot of where emissions happen is in cities, through the energy used in buildings, through the transportation sector, and cities have a lot of ability to impact the ways in which we use energy for those two major sectors.
The Met Council provides a lot of tools and resources to our local governments and technical assistance around the area of climate change. I'm super excited about this new tool that the Met Council is rolling out, which is our greenhouse gas scenario planning tool for our local government partners. It's critically important for our local governments to know if their initiatives around climate are working or not. So this scenario planning tool will help them decide which action they should take to have the most impact in their region.
Our scenario planning tool will provide flexible and tailored strategies for Minnesotan cities to reduce emissions. Our tool is built on collaboration with leading researchers in the greenhouse gas emissions mitigation field and is compatible with all types of cities.
I am Anu Ramaswamy, a professor at Princeton University. I'm the lead faculty director of the Sustainable Healthy Cities Network, which brings together researchers from multiple institutions to work together on sustainable urban development. My team has developed a greenhouse gas scenario planning tool for the Twin Cities metropolitan region in Minnesota, which helps different communities of different types chart pathways towards net zero emissions, bringing together strategies across multiple sectors. These sectors include compact land use, mobility, buildings, waste, and green infrastructure and trees.
The scenario planning tool will be offered on an easy-to-use and easy-to-understand online platform. Cities can investigate different mitigation scenarios and strategies and use the tool to identify solutions tailored to their communities. Testing various planning scenarios such as green infrastructure, building energy use, and transportation will help cities better understand and forecast their greenhouse gas emissions in the coming decades.
Cities should use the greenhouse gas scenario planning tool to determine priorities in climate action planning. We live in very uncertain times. Technology is changing rapidly, and the pandemic showed us that our driving and energy use will change for reasons that we cannot control. Therefore, we are taking an exploratory scenario planning approach, where we acknowledge that there is not one, but many scenarios.
The first bucket of strategies is compact land use development. Compact land use development can reduce greenhouse gas emissions in two ways. First, it can help reduce the need for traveling long distances and encourage the use of multimodal transportation. And second, compact development promotes more multifamily buildings, which are very helpful in saving emissions per person. The second bucket of strategies is energy efficient technologies. The greenhouse gas scenario planning tool includes a number of new and emerging technologies. For example, electric cars, which can be an excellent low carbon energy efficient alternatives to conventional internal combustion engines. The third bucket of strategies is conservation and sustainable behaviors. There are a number of policy instruments that are modeled in the greenhouse gas scenario planning tool, which encourage people to use energy more efficiently and to engage in sustainable practices. In addition, we also model behavioral nudging that can encourage people by leveraging their social networks or through other forms of messaging to engage in sustainable behaviors. For example, road pricing as a policy can encourage people to drive less or to have more vehicle occupants in the same vehicle, which can be incredibly powerful in reducing energy use. Renewable energy and fuel switching is the fourth lever in the path towards zero carbon emissions. Indeed, zero carbon electricity is a critical pathway to get to zero carbon emissions overall. And cities can play a big role by promoting the adoption of local solar panels that can generate renewable energy locally within communities to complement the utilities getting to net zero. The action by utilities, larger utilities, to develop net zero electricity is extremely critical and complements the action of cities and communities. So the fifth lever of change is carbon sequestration, which can be done through trees and increasing reforestation and having compact development so that urban land is not overtaking existing forests or agricultural land. By twinning reforestation and preventing urban expansion into forests and agricultural land, cities can blend together nature-based solutions in their path to net zero.
The creation of a new scenario planning tool could be really valuable for us in that we're always trying literally month to month to figure out where's the best use of our time in focusing in on reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And scenarios can help us decide whether to focus more on particular transportation initiatives or building energy initiatives or other things that we know we have to do. But it can really help us decide which ones we need to do first, which actions can have the most impact, and how to stage those over time.
A city might want to change one or a few of the assumptions that we have built in the tool. So then we can work together to adjust the assumptions and improve on our initial version.
All of these things work together to create synergistic multiplicative benefits that are really helpful for communities to drive towards zero carbon emissions.
If we don't start with good quality information, we don't necessarily know where we're going, and we don't necessarily have the most effective means of figuring out how to get there.
As Minnesotans, we already experience the extremes of climate change, and more changes are inevitable. The Metropolitan Council is committed to partnering with our region's cities and communities to face these challenges with data, research, and practical tools. Utilizing the Council Scenario Planning tool is one opportunity for us to act together for a better future.
If we're going to have an impact on climate change, that means every one of us doing what we can in our own household, in our own neighborhood, in our own city, and our own region, our own state, our own nation. And collectively, that will have an impact. And so the Met Council is a piece of this jigsaw puzzle, that working collaboratively with our partners, we can have an impact.
Thanks so much, everybody, for watching that video about the tool. We are now entering the next part of our agenda, which is going to be to hear from two professors that worked on our tool. So getting a little bit more information on exploring decarbonization strategies in the transportation sector. And then we're going to explore decarbonization strategies in the building, energy, forestry, and waste sectors. So first we have with us Dr. Kara Kockelman, who is a professional engineer and professor of civil engineering at the University of Texas at Austin. Kara's work has focused on the implications of transportation planning and help lead the efforts for the transportation sector of our scenario planning tool. So I'll pass it over to Kara. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Let me just get up to that first slide. I don't use Teams as often as I should. We're usually here on Zoom at UT Austin. This work has largely been done by somebody who's teaching right now. Professor Jason Hawkins was my postdoc during this work. He graduated from University of Toronto a year ago, but now is teaching at University of Nebraska in Lincoln. So I think he's teaching a travel demand modeling class right now to forecast traffic across maybe the Lincoln area or the Toronto area, but he is really an expert in carbon. That's been a focus for him and for me and my students, but he's also great at tool development. So we have your region, about 3.2 million people and lots of private vehicle use, just like we have here in Austin and probably in Lincoln, Nebraska, and still a lot of undeveloped land. So big choices there for all of you. As you know, just the annual survey by the Bureau the Census Bureau has told us, you guys are still very much focused on the car, especially for that commute to work, which tends to be a longer trip. And when we look at all of the mitigation scenarios in the transportation and land use domains, the best strategies, are really looking at how you grow and the density, of course, as well as some transit opportunities, walking, biking, of course, the lowest carbon modes, but also hard work for the walker or the biker. And then there's a lot of unused capacity inside those cars. So some just ride sharing and ideally getting that to go more dynamic so people don't plan ahead or have to plan ahead. That's really tough. So willingness to share rides with others, especially as we get more into self-driving vehicle technology or autonomous taxis, sort of like an Uber pool application. That's something I do a lot of work on planning, for 20 years forward in my work. And so the transportation component of this wonderful tool is looking at 2040, and those greenhouse gas emissions are based on the mode and technology shares. So in terms of technology share, it's on the transit side, so on the motorized side, as well as, of course, the personal automobile. And there's a lot of options these days, and we're really hoping to see more electric vehicle adoption yesterday. So as soon as possible. I don't think Tesla can keep up. The other manufacturers really have to get those assembly lines retooled and get those vehicles producing, and the prices shifted to really help favor those and make it an easier decision in all types of makes and models, because of course a lot of Americans want the SUVs, and here in Texas I'm afraid you do see a lot of the pickup trucks. And the fuel economy is really important, even if that's for a Tesla, like the one I just drove into work here. So that's an MPG equivalent, and that's that lowercase e in the subscript there. There's well-to-wheel, so life cycle analysis. You have to not just look at what's being burned in the tank, but how that gets there. And so all of these assumptions are embedded in this tool that the Met Council has created for you all. And they're doing baseline trend projections. So if you don't have any interventions, what is it going to look like in 2040 in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, not just for the whole region, but for each major city? And then you guys get to say, well, what if we are more focused on increasing density or shifting that technology towards electric vehicles? And there's a lot of elasticities, which is how the greenhouse gas number or the vehicle miles traveled number or other performance metrics would change in response to those policies. And there's a lot of strategies out there. The ones that we're really focused on are electrification of personal vehicles as well as transit vehicles, the e-buses. Super important, but takes a long time to shift that fleet. Here in Austin, you know, we've got 100 planned, but it will take a while because a lot of our existing buses are quite new. So where do those go? You know, do they go to Mexico if nobody else wants them here in the U.S.? So they will still be on the road, but hopefully replacing, you know, much less efficient vehicles. And then there's that ride sharing, which can be done today. It doesn't take a self-driving vehicle. A lot easier when the vehicle is paying attention to where it needs to go to pick up multiple occupants. But it can be done right now with your own phone in your pocket there. It's called Waze Carpool. And so we'd love to see places like Minneapolis, St. Paul, and Austin, of course, start using existing apps. This is a picture from Singapore. I don't know how many of you know what ERP stands for. It's electronic road pricing. They've had it for decades, and now they're going to a phone-based electronic road pricing. So that's another transport policy that helps reduce vehicle miles traveled, which is what we have here as VMT. And of course reduces congestion, which is why they wanted it. Not sure why my pen isn't working in Microsoft Teams. It works for me in Zoom, but the congestion is also what they've always worried about on that small island nation. And of course, you guys have some congestion. We've got lots of it in Austin. So there's different reasons for invoking these kinds of policies. Parking is often underpriced, and you know, COVID has showed us how to do a lot of things electronically, even telehealth and shopping, of course. So that may be able to reduce our footprints. And then there's other things at the federal and state level, like the gas tax and something called pay-as-you-drive insurance. May have, you know, the gas tax certainly affects what kinds of vehicles people purchase and those that they choose from trip to trip, depending on the length of the trip. And then also, of course, how far they go. But these are more at the state and federal level. So we hope Minneapolis and, of course, the U.S. Will do this. But it's a lack of courage on the part of the legislators, both at the state and federal level. So gas tax hasn't changed for 30 years here in Texas at either the state or the federal levels. Lots of land use strategies. These take time, of course. You have to be pretty engaged, and I think Met Council does that beautifully. Increasing in simple densities helps make parking a little more scarce and makes walking a lot easier in terms of distances. And so upzoning is so important. You guys are certainly leading the nation in that strategy, and I sure wish Austin would follow you. Of course, allowing mixtures of uses, which is that image on the upper right, and increasing network connectivity. So it's interesting how having continuous paths really facilitates more walking because people don't have to go around the block. It doesn't feel like they're wasting their energy. And then making transit stops more accessible, or what I like to think of for the future is a network of small self-driving vehicles that are subsidized by the transit agencies who have a lot of money here in Austin, and you can really save a lot of money and get a lot more people using these kinds of all-electric, self-driving, demand responsive, almost door-to-door, but with stops all over the place. So Lake Elmo is the example. I think maybe Jason was asked to show here a lot of wedges for how much each strategy buys you. And there's the baseline trends and things like the population doubling in that city, but having, even though it's a big, I guess, population increase, but unfortunately a rather low electric vehicle uptake, but fortunately fewer passenger miles per capita over time due to more interesting land uses, I imagine. Not a big reduction from Xcel Energy, which provides power for that period, that 22-year period. But of course, that can change dramatically, and we hope that does. We hope that CO2 per kilowatt hour generated from your power plants does go down dramatically. And there's land use wedges also depending on choices made. But one thing that's really interesting to me is even though the population's expected to double across the region and probably more than double in Lake Elmo, you have to be really careful with how that development happens. It's hard to increase the density. So Jason's models only get you up just a nudge to a 9.35 persons per hectare developed hectare. So across the entire city of Lake Elmo, you can easily double or triple the gross density. But what we're really focused on here in terms of affecting human behavior is per developed land acre hectare. And then he's got transportation improvements, and you guys will get to see how that tool works in a little bit. We've got economic policies like that, a fee on each mile traveled in that future year, and parking prices perhaps doubling, how much that can buy you. And that's important. There's big trade-offs that you guys are making, and this is important to see before you make those decisions. So in a future scenario, if we could get you up to basically 100% electric vehicles, although 20% of them kind of look like conventional vehicles, they're just hybrid versus plug-in hybrid or all electric, so battery only. And if you've got many people choosing to share rides, so that's the dynamic ride sharing component, and those shared rides are always in an all electric fleet, like a self-driving fleet, for example. And you've got one vehicle per 10 persons, for example, and of course there's some extra vehicle miles traveled to go get those people, so there can be some empty travel or some circuitous travel. Then you get maybe an 80%. And if you get the grid decarbonization, these are the kinds of things that we're hoping to see for not just your region, of course, but for the entire planet and cities like Austin and others. So there can be big greenhouse gas reductions depending on how we play our cards. And it does take a lot of policies. Anu is about to tell you more, especially on the greening, I think, which is an exciting opportunity to really go net negative on greenhouse gases. And the land use change, not much of an impact there, but reforestation, I think, is pretty exciting. So that's where a lot of my charitable donations go, is towards that effort. And yeah, transit is also not a big policy for a lot of us, but of course it is basic for access for many people in our regions. And technology change towards electrification, and of course those more green feedstocks in our power mix, super important. So we thank you for doing what you're doing, and hope that everybody will follow you right away, because you guys are leaders. So I don't know if we have time for questions. I think we move right on into Anu, but I'll be looking at the chat box.
Thanks so much, Dr. Coughlin. I think we can see here that a lot of background research has gone into this tool, and that leads us to the next piece of that research, which is exploring the decarbonization strategies in the building, energy, forestry, and waste sectors. And this is, I'll be introducing Dr. Anu Ramaswamy. who is no stranger to Minnesota. She's currently at Princeton, but she's an interdisciplinary environmental engineer and professor of civil and environmental engineering at Princeton. Anu's work supports sustainable urban infrastructure systems and helped lead many of the research efforts for the scenario planning tool, including the land use, green infrastructure, and building energy sectors. I'll pass it over to Anu. Thank you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can, and we can see your presentation too.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And I just want to say hello. I recognize many of you that have spoken from my time in Minnesota, and I'm so glad to continue this work from Princeton with all of the communities in the Metropolitan Council. So I'm going to be talking about a model that we've developed for any community, and here we're sharing it with the Metropolitan Council that then can be plugged into scenario modeling tools. And so this is called a multi-sector zero carbon model for communities integrating buildings, energy, waste, and greenery. Okay, so wonderful. So I want to quickly acknowledge my team, which includes Kangkang Tong, Bhartendu Pandey, and Roshan Shankar that did a lot of the modeling for the net zero transitions. And our larger project partners, which of course includes the Met Council, as well as the UT Austin team, teams from Minnesota, and LEAF, who helped us with the inventory development. So very quickly, I want to say that the work I'm going to present builds on 3 foundational papers from my lab. The first one is talking about how do we even measure GHG inventory to inform a net zero carbon future. And Angie Fife referred to this. You know, we need to really think about what emissions and how we measure emissions to really align our net zero trajectories with regional and national trajectories. The second one relates to a pathway paper on how do you go from low to net zero carbon cities. And the third paper is focusing on implementing the framework in the Metropolitan Council, which is this project. And I'm so happy to share this model that we're creating called Zeek that can be applied to any community in the US. So moving forward, the first paper talks about how do you do carbon accounting for net zero carbon cities. And I won't belabor it except to say that this paper is a multi-authored paper with authors from WRI, ICLEI, and several universities. And the paper is arguing that to really align your net zero goals with state goals and national goals, we should be looking at zero carbon transboundary infrastructure and food systems. And so we're covering, as you know, mobility, buildings, energy supply, water supply, and waste. And food and construction materials are also important, but they're outside the scope of this project. Although we got excited and actually modeled timber buildings, just for you to see what that would do in terms of carbon sequestration. And the second is this pathways framework that fundamentally to get to net zero, this is a recent paper that just came out, there's only 3 things we can do: reduce demand, switch supply, and enhance carbon uptake. And we already saw this in the video. You can reduce demand through spatial planning, sectoral and cross-sector efficiency and behaviors. We can switch supply through decarbonizing electricity, switching electric heating and mobility to heat pumps and electric vehicles, and doing waste to energy and other valorization projects. And then the last is to focus on green infrastructure and timber buildings to enhance carbon uptake and stocks. And that is the gut of our model, which we've modeled in 2 contrasting cities to test out the model. The first is St. Paul, which is a central city, and the second is Lake Elmo. And I'm going to share very preliminary results for Lake Elmo. This has to go through peer review, and we'll have a model that also has been peer reviewed. So the first step in modeling is to do a baseline carbon footprinting and a trend projection. And as you can see here, in Lake Elmo, the population nearly doubles. The numbers are cut off below, but around from 10,400 to about 20,000. And you can see the GHGs are almost doubling in the baseline trend projection. And this includes energy use in buildings, industry, and commercial, as well as embodied energy of building materials. each year. We then use this projection. So for the Lake Elmo example, and what's really unique about our project is that we were able to do trend projections for each community based on the single family stock, the square footage per housing unit, the increase in square footage over the past 10 years, as well as the increase in energy intensity. And so for each community, we've developed this trend based on your own past 10 years of data. And we've aligned this with other estimates statewide. So this aligns with Minnesota's statewide efforts. But I want to highlight that this project is the first project to quantify individual city-level energy use projections based on granular data of your own building stock, your own energy intensity, and your own employment characteristics. So that's pretty neat to be doing that. So then we want to move on to the step 2, which is applying the framework to Lake Elmo as an example city. And I won't get into all of the details, but I want you to see in pictures what are some of the strategies we use. So let me first list the strategies. We considered a number of strategies to reduce demand for buildings' energy. And these included things like compact buildings. We considered the Metropolitan Council's multifamily housing effects because the Met Council's plan include a fair amount of increase in the Lake Elmo area of multifamily housing. We looked at energy efficient, new and existing construction, behavioral nudging, and smart grid enabled conservation. We looked at switching energy supply. We modeled Xcel Energy's decarbonization plan, which aims for 80% decarbonization of 2018 by 2040. We looked at electrifying heating. We looked at renewable natural gas aligned with Minnesota's policy. And then we looked at enhancing carbon uptake and sinks through timber buildings and land use change and massive, aggressive and modest reforestation. So I'm really thrilled to explain these very briefly to each of you. And I'll focus on each of those interventions mainly in pictures. So the first step is to reduce land demand via land use planning and compactness. And the potential to achieve this can be quite high, particularly because as you think of multifamily housing, it results in smaller floor area per capita and per housing unit, which is associated with less energy use. The second strategy, which has a relatively smaller effect, is tree planting. We actually were able to model the effect of tree planting with very innovative fine-scale data provided to us by the by the Xcel Energy for the St. Paul region. So those were included in the model. We looked at reducing demand via building energy efficiency. We looked at the potential to build new buildings near passive house standards. So in our model, we assumed that X% of new buildings will have passive house standards, and you in the scenario planning tool can actually change that percentage. So that's the beauty of this, that you can change the percentage of adoption, so you can see what these strategies do as you learn about the scenario planning tool. The existing buildings, retrofitting is more challenging. Earlier efforts like LEED Gold and other checklist-based approaches have been shown to actually not consistently result in energy use reductions. And so we're really encouraging benchmarking, and Minnesota is already leading with the B3 benchmarking project. And so really thinking about benchmarking so that you can actually deliver on energy use reductions. We modeled real-time energy displays that are visible so people can see their home energy consumption, and behavioral nudging, and even the future smart grid. The Pacific Northwest Lab has shown that you can achieve 10% energy use reduction through the smart grid, which is really important. On the supply side, we drew on several resources to model grid decarbonization. Many of these are outside of my own group, but first of all, I wanted to say, here's an article from David Roberts at Vox that talked about Xcel Energy. that a major US utility is moving towards cleaner energy faster than expected. And so we used Xcel Energy's goal to be, Xcel Energy's goal is 100% net zero carbon electricity by 2050. And we used 80% by 2040, which is our scenario. We also drew upon Princeton University's net zero carbon report, which just came out, which actually tells you how you can get to net zero in different utilities across different parts of the US. And we use this model to estimate the cost of the transition. And you can see that it's primarily using wind and solar and a small amount of biomass in this grid decarbonization model. And that means you have a lot of potential by going to net zero carbon electricity to effectively switch your heating. So we modeled electrifying heating with heat pumps, drawing upon efficiencies from the Center for Energy and Environment's report. So in other words, we use local data, local efficiencies, local climate-related performance of heat pumps, assuming 59% of the building stock adopts heat pumps. This is consistent with model assumptions in several national and state models. And then we looked at switching supply, creating renewable natural gas from waste resources. And this is consistent with Minnesota's Natural Gas Innovation Act. And so we leveraged that. We were able to look at municipal solid waste, wastewater, and agricultural waste statewide and allocate it per capita to each city. And then that takes us to the last set of strategies, which is on greenery and stocks, improving carbon stocks. And many of you may know this, but mass timber buildings can be a phenomenal way of literally storing the forest in your buildings. And these mass timber buildings use a lot more wood than conventional timber buildings. So here's a building that's being planned in Minnesota. Here's another one that's being built in Portland. And so these buildings can be very effective. And so we modeled half of new multifamily buildings would become mass timber buildings. We did a life cycle assessment. These are we modeled 4 to 8 story buildings could actually do this. And then last, we looked at land use change and greenery. We actually recently produced a paper that uses satellite imagery and machine learning to develop a fine-scale land use and greenery map. We've expanded that work. This just came out in ES&T. In 2020, we've expanded that work to each of the 182 city and town units. And once we do that, we can then model reforestation. So we modeled modest reforestation, which is converting half of your permeable land to forests. But we also modeled aggressive reforestation just to see what it might look like, which means 100% of your pervious surface, golf courses, parks, etc., get converted to forests. Now we know you're not going to do that, but that's the beauty of the scenario planning tool. It allows you to change the percentage and see what it actually looks in your community. And then we bring it all together in a wedge. And I'm so excited by this wedge because what it tells you is, yes, we've proposed a lot of very strong efficiency approaches. We've leveraged on existing decarbonization policies and fuel switching that gets you much lower. So reducing demand, switching energy supply. And then you see the effect of biomass-based building materials, about 8%. And then you get the massive effect of land use change and biogenic carbon sequestration. Now, this is only possible in suburbs like Lake Elmo, where there is a lot of land. And so the greenery and the reforestation obviously is not very possible in the central cities, but that's what the beauty of this model is. It helps you bring together all of these strategies. It tells you what percentage we're assuming, and then the scenario planning tool will allow each of you to change those percentages so you can change the uptake in your own community of these strategies. In the interest of time, I think I have a few more minutes. I'm just going to quickly say that this is the detail. that the Met Council planning itself with multifamily buildings reduces emissions by 6%. You have land use and floor area efficiencies, technology efficiencies, and behavioral impacts. The next slide zooms in on grid decarbonization, which obviously is a big player, 23% of emissions just from the electric grid becoming decarbonized. Fuel switching to electric heat pumps reduces another 16%. Again, this was based on 59% of stock converting, but you can change those percentages in the tool. And then the third is looking at biomass buildings and land use sequestration. And so the big message is from my side is that really we can shape the future. Our multi-sector model shows net zero emissions are indeed possible by leveraging multi-sector innovations. Cities can choose the percentage participation rates in the scenario tool. The other thing is that this tool shows different strategies to have different impacts in different city types. For example, there's less reforestation opportunities in central cities. But on the other hand, central cities in St. Paul, we modeled district energy systems, which are much more tangible and feasible in central cities, wastewater heat recovery. I do believe that partnerships between academia, cities, towns, and regions, and civil society organizations like ICLEI and WRI can help us together envision the future. The next steps for our team is that there are science questions even in all of these scenarios. So for example, can you get credit for using timber buildings? What assumptions are required in forests outside for cities to get the credit for timber buildings? Can we actually support reforestation in the forests in the US to support mass timber expansion in all US cities? So there are many important science-based questions, but there are also policy questions and science questions around equity and costs and benefits that can allow us to explore which options and what is truly sustainable, not only within the cities, but in this broader systems framework. So with that, I'll stop. Thank you, and provide my contact information to let me know your thoughts and questions in addition to the chat. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Dr. Ramaswamy. That was excellent, a very in-depth review. Now we're going to enter the feedback portion of our agenda, and I'll pass it over to Mauricio Leon, senior researcher at the Metropolitan Council and the project lead on this project. Mauricio.
Thank you so much, Eric. And I want to maybe start by addressing some of the questions that appear in the chat. I think that we have Professor Ramaswamy and Professor Kokelman here. So there's a question from, start with a question for Professor Ramaswamy. It says, regarding timber construction, this question comes from Katie Jones. Regarding timber construction, like that using the T3 building, I wonder what the impact is of the binders in the beams. Is the assumption that the GHG footprint of such binders is still much lower than, say, steel or other materials? Is that too detailed of an issue for this model?
So that's a great question, and that's actually why the life cycle assessment is important. So in this model, we used life cycle assessments from several studies, 2 in the Netherlands and some emerging studies that are looking at that. But the second thing I wanted to say, which is really important to keep in mind, if you imagine a net zero carbon future, you could potentially have zero carbon electricity, not just in Met Council, but all over, right? You could have zero carbon gas, like the Minnesota plan. And so the GHG emissions of creating those binders and those chemicals can potentially also decrease. And so this is why I said there are important science questions. How we model and do LCA in a net zero carbon future is very different from how we do it conventionally. So today, those binders may have an impact, but in a net zero future, that's what the LCA calculates. And it is actually in a net zero future, that impact is relatively small. The other thing I wanted to say, just on this question, there is assumptions on storage. So can cities get credit for storing the timber because we just moved it from the forest into the city? And that's only feasible if you have sustainable forestry going on to regrow the timber. And those are the assumptions you will see as the scenario builds out. As I said, this isn't part of the contract with Met Council. We're just doing it because it's a frontier research topic, and I'm excited by it.
Thank you, Professor Ramaswamy. Professor Kokelman, you saw a few questions for you on the chat. Do you wanna, and you provided some answers. Do you wanna expand on any of those questions?
Gosh, I can't think of any. Let me know if there's something I should be responding to.
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry it took me a while to find the Q&A, which is different from the chat box that I get to see as a presenter. So sorry to all the attendees for my delay on that.
No worries. I think there's a question for Professor Ramaswamy. Someone did not agree with lead goal not performing, and maybe you want to say more about that.
I'm happy to share papers. It's not that lead goal doesn't perform, but when you've actually looked at performance data, lead goal is a checklist-based approach that gives you a checklist credit for things other than energy. And so you could achieve lead gold without necessarily having high, in other words, we're looking with the passive house standard, we're looking at very high energy use reductions. So all I'm saying is you want to have quantitative standards for your energy use to impact GHG emissions, and LEED as such doesn't have those performance-based standards, which now are being integrated, but Minnesota has the benchmarking project that actively gives you this data. That's all I'm saying. But I'm happy to share papers that have said that the conventional checklist-based approach, there is a spread. So when you look at actual energy performance with silver, gold, and so forth, you're seeing relatively a lot of scatter. In other words, there's some buildings can give you the energy, deliver the energy benefits, some buildings can't. Behavior is a big portion. And so actually getting real data on energy use is always better than what the checklist-based standard tells you.
Thank you, Professor. So we are now moving to the next phase of this, where we actually want to hear from you in an open and anonymous way. So the way that we keep your comments anonymous is through Mentimeter. You can go to this website, or you can access the link that my colleagues are sending you right now on the Q&A tool for Microsoft Teams. And here you can provide an open-ended question for this, an open-ended answer for what does or does not resonate with you about the transportation presentation. This is your opportunity to express any concerns, as well as anything that you like or anything that you feel should be addressed in the transportation specifically presentation that you saw. So we're going to give you a few minutes to just to go into Mentimeter. And you can start answering that question. While folks go into Mentimeter, I'm checking for any other questions that could be addressed right now. So
I saw a really neat, sorry, go ahead, Marisha.
Go ahead.
I thought there was a really neat question on prairie restoration. That's a great question. And so we can model other land use changes too. It doesn't have to be to trees. So the different land cover types, we can model, grassland, wetlands. If you don't have to do trees, you can invest in constructed wetlands. But then, how much constructed wetlands can you do? But the point being, if that's of interest, looking at other than trees would give you one of the biggest carbon benefits, but the land use modeling tool can model any land use switches. But it's a great question, because you can sequester carbon in other types of lands too, land cover types.
Well, we're seeing right now some comments on the transportation presentation. We see higher parking prices can lead to change. Someone's really concerned with equity impacts of the pricing-based policies discussed. Someone's saying here, hope the tools link to more detailed research to pursue strategies. And that's something that we will talk more about. Someone says is concerned that it might rely too much on techno-optimism and less on proven near-term solutions. Here's one that says, I think that it will be helpful to have a demo to comprehend how we model software will work at even a small area live during the presentation. Okay. The electronic road pricing example will surely lead to behavior change to move to electric multi-person vehicles. And you can see your more of these comments on the screen. Professor, do you have any reaction to any of these comments that you're seeing on the screen?
I do.
Yes.
So I'm glad that person asked about the equity issue, and I'm just typing something into that Q&A box. I should have written credit-based congestion pricing because I too am extremely anxious about Lexus lanes and pricing, lower income households off the road, especially those who have to live far from their destinations and have really tight schedules because of their life circumstances. So I always advocate for revenue neutral policies to help people get the space that they need. They all share the network kind of equitably. The toughest thing about credit-based congestion pricing is where you draw the line on who gets the credits. Is it just adults or 16 years and older? Do the 16-year-olds get the same credits as the working adults? And where's the line? At what county or at what point do the credits maybe fall off? And of course there's enforcement issues because you've got people that run through the region, your region, that are visitors, and so they're not really in the system, so they get a couple free rides, and then as soon as you spot them more often, you've got an accounting of how much they owe from being actually a regular user of your network. So yeah, there's costs to all of that. There's administrative costs, there's enforcement costs, so we have a lot of papers about that, and I've provided a link.
Thank you, Professor. And we can share these comments with attendees after the event. But if my colleagues want to scroll down so that we can read just the remaining comments here. Yes, Cara, you seem like you want to say something.
Oh no, I just like the Waze carpool mentioned.
Yes.
Yeah, a lot of people have no idea that exists. It's something we could easily be doing now. And those of you who have long commutes, you might want to go ahead and input that and give people rides. And if you want 50 cents a mile, that they are allowed to price up to that. But I usually just give my rides for free. But my commutes are so short that it's they haven't really matched me with anybody, and you need a lot of users to get the match rates up so that it actually ends up helping people. But of course, if any of you are doing long distance trips, there's ways to match rides online, and your kids may be coming back from college or whatever, just great ways to help fill those seats and help humans interact, which is important, especially during this isolation of COVID.
Thank you, Professor. We're going to move now to the next Mentimeter question. We really appreciate your feedbacks on the transportation portion. This is about Professor Ramaswamy's presentation on building green infrastructure and waste. So here we have an opportunity to comment on what you thought about that portion of the greenhouse gas scenario planning tool. So we're going to give you a minute to write down your comments. I see questions about goal setting, and that is a really important question. I think what the challenge that these researchers took was, can we actually get to zero? It might not be politically feasible, it might not be financially feasible, but is it possible? And then the goal setting comes after. What is actually a realistic goal? So I see that there's a good point about goal setting. I think that that's a conversation that we need to expand in the tool. I see a J for mass timber. Surprised by the impact of greening.
I want to emphasize that's just in Lake Elmo. You will not see that big of an impact in another community, but that's the beauty of the tool, that you can see what it does in different communities. And that if we had time, we would have showed you St. Paul too. There was, it would have been too much in this presentation, but it's just a sliver in St. Paul.
Sounds like the wedge data visualization is confused. There are other ways in which this can be represented. Wedge is one of the common ones, but we can, in the interface, provide different options for users. I appreciate the emphasis on sprawl reduction and compact land use. How do we systematically improve the energy efficiency of existing homes and buildings? Great challenge.
So actually that is included as a strategy, and we use each community's energy use intensity. So because we were able to get each community's energy use, we calculated each community's square footage from the tax parcel tax assessors database, and we also used Zillow data. So actually what you have is very granular data about your own community. You can look at gas use and electricity use, and then think about how to improve efficiency. I also wanted to say that automatically, as buildings become more energy efficient, there's a trajectory to improve energy intensity, and that's also included in the model. I was looking at the 56, that's actually 59% adoption of heat pumps. That actually is in line with these other studies, because in cold climates where those adoption rates vary by climate, so we drew upon other models, and you can increase your adoption. This would be good. I think if each city can get to a higher adoption, that's fantastic. But these are the regional participation rates that are being used in the national model, and our default follows that. But if you want to go higher than that, you have in the scenario tool, you can tweak it and you'll see the impact.
Perfect. All right. Well, thank you so much. Please finalize your comments on the greenhouse gas scenario planning tool. We're now going to move to the next phase of feedback, which is actually about the user interface of this tool. What this means is we're going to be showing how users will be able to access this data. Again, they did it. They did an example for Lake Elmo and for St. Paul, but the idea is that it's going to work for every city, every county on the metro region, so in the 7-county metro region. And what we're going to show you now, it's doesn't display the actual results. It's not displaying real results. What is displaying is how is the user interface going to look like. And we would love to have your feedback on the user interface. By the way, we're going to do this is at the end of this meeting, you're going to receive a link where you can access the web application. You can click around and see what the web application looks like, but again, do know that it's not displaying real results. It's just displaying the functionality. So I'm gonna share my screen so that you see what this tool is looking like. Again, this is just for feedback purposes only. Users will be able to enter this web application, and on this GHG scenario planning tab, they're going to be able to see their city. So we have 3 fictional cities here. They're going to be able to select the main visual. So that includes the 5 categories of strategies that we've been discussing. And then these tabs will show specific results for transportation, buildings, green infrastructure. So by clicking this, users will be able to actually look at the specific sectors that we have covered. The users will be able to have a to customize the strategies that they want to see. So turn on or off strategies. Again, this is all fictional at this point, but it's all based on the work that you have seen from Professor Ramaswamy and Professor Kokelman. And then they can select strategies based on the 5 categories that we discussed. So they can see impacts of electric vehicles. They can see the impacts of commercial, residential heating electrification, on the smart grid, on retrofitting buildings, new home efficiency, behavioral strategies, telework, clean energy supplies, so grid decarbonization, renewable natural gas, sequestering carbon, conservation tillage, and tree planting. So again, these are the strategies were identified after an initial stakeholder engagement that we had back in May of 2020. So we will provide the link for this demo of the tool, and the link will disappear after today. So if you want to provide feedback, you will be given a form. And in that form, you can basically write any comment that you like. And we will take your feedback very seriously. And that will really help us to improve this web application, which is expected to be available sometime in February or March of next year. I want to say a comment, so just for clarification, one thing that is different about our tool is, again, if there's any disagreement about the assumptions that go in the tool, users will have access to the methodology, and we can work together to modify those assumptions. It's made with the best data sets available for Minnesota metro cities. Some of those data sets are data sets that we manage here at the Metropolitan Council. We have hired experts, of course, for this work. And it's one tool that looks at multiple sectors. So these are some of the advantages of using our tool. And with that, I think we can now move to closing remarks. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen right now.
Yeah, thanks, Mauricio. I just want to thank everybody for taking the time, not only the presenters who made time out of their busy schedules, but also all of the attendees. I noticed that there's some really great Q&A in that box. And, I appreciate people being really engaged on this topic. I think that going forward, this is going to be so exciting for our region as we, not only at the Met Council, in terms of our operations and planning function, but also all of the cities and townships and counties in our region, how they can actually use data to support good decision-making processes, especially related to climate. So this is very exciting. It's a big step. I wanted to pass it back to Mauricio to talk a little bit about any next steps. And I also wanted to allow the opportunity for people to contact Mauricio if they have any questions going forward.
Yes, thank you so much. And my email is displayed on the screen right now. Please feel free to contact me directly if you have any concerns or questions, or you want to get involved with this tool. We would love to have you participate. And again, today will be the time to comment on the user interface. You will be sent that link. And other than that, we really appreciate your time and participation. I know 1.5 hours is a big ask, so we really appreciate it. And with that, I think that we could probably adjourn the webinar soon. Thank you so much, and we really appreciate it.